Okay, folks, hello. This is Jason Grabosky with Rutgers University, reprising the talk that we had over lunch at the 100th anniversary of the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation and its annual meeting. The talk today is a brief historical review of the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation. A very exciting time, and it's a landmark worth noting. Let's think back in 1925. So much was going on. We elected the first female governor in the United States. La Crusette fused some beautiful porcelain onto cast iron cookware, revolutionizing how we do a slow cook. And the Grand Ole Opry had its first performance 100 years ago. Back then, things were a little bit different. We had big political arguments about whether science could be taught in the classroom and the role of religion versus science during the monkey trials, the Scopes monkey trial per se. Also, we had books about the disparity of wealth versus the working class in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, published 1925. And the great race in Alaska in 1925 with the diphtheria serum being run to Nome, Alaska. Togo was the lead sled dog that did all the hard work. It's just that Balto ran the last legs, so Balto got all the credit. But big things were happening in 1925. A little bit closer to home in Pennsylvania, Alpha Phi Omega started as a service fraternity. It is now one of the largest service-based organizations on college campuses today. And speaking of college campuses, at Rutgers University, 100 years ago at Rutgers University, the Chrysler Herbarium opened its doors. And this is a big celebration year for our herbarium and the mycological collections at Rutgers University. But we're supposed to be talking about trees and communities. So let's start talking about trees and communities. We won't go back this far. This is Lucca, Italy, where we see some of the first mentioning of trees as the lungs of the city. And here you can see the green beltway that was the walled fortress that enclosed the ancient city, so that from a distance, it looked like you were looking at a wooded stand, not a city. So there was a military advantage to this too. But they found that people liked being on the walls because people like trees. And in a hot climate in central Italy, this was where they found pleasure in the shade amongst the trees. We could go back to Zurich. Zurich has had a 470-year urban forest management plan continuously run, and you can still go into the city halls and see some of the early notes about what they were trying to do to take care of their community's tree canopy. Now we've got to go a little bit closer to home, so let's start in Philadelphia. That's almost New Jersey. And back in the late 1700s, Benjamin Franklin saw that insurance was a neat way to make some money. And so from London, England, he brought over the contribution ship company, and they were home insurance companies. And in 1781, they chose to refuse to give people insurance policies if trees were in front of the house. Now, the sign that you see on the left was a metal sign that hung on the house. So when fire response people came, they could see if the house was one that they were allowed to put out or not, based on whether they were insured. And as fire insurance goes, trees got in the way of the equipment. So they said, we're not going to insure anybody unless they take down their trees. Now, people like their trees. And so, in response, they were so upset, the people who chose to show up, organize, built a competing company that became the Mutual Assurance Company. And for people who wanted trees on their properties, they insured them very specifically. They had their own little door hanging, which you can see on the right, picturing a tree, because communities have always been able to organize and advocate for the living landscapes that provide a quality of life to their community. On a more industrial scale, back in the day, now we're back into Europe, and in the late 1800s, Haussmann came up with a plan for Napoleon III to straighten the rows and redesign Paris, France. And this was a huge municipal project where they tore down whole village sections, straightened the rows, and they used trees in this case to provide living environmental portions, in part to protect the buildings, but also to give people a sense that they had a vested connection to trees, which represented nature and wealth to them in the urban core. Now, those projects took a long time. The last one was completed in 1927, but in the 1850s to the 1870s, this was big doings, influencing major artists and also influencing almost every city across Europe. This was so fashionable as a design, the street line boulevard. It was so liked that the design idea spread across Europe faster than the bubonic plague. And as a matter of fact, if we thought about it, we could look at places like Washington, D.C., which was also lined out to be tree-lined boulevards in that grand boulevard as a statement where large dimension trees frame large dimensioned public buildings to give that sense of permanence and awe and quality in that urban core. And we can see the original drawing up on the upper left here. And you can see these are some pictures from Google Earth of Pennsylvania Avenue. And you can see the width is still there because you can't really move some of these old buildings. But we have reconfigured how we put trees into the landscape in this particular situation. But they've always been part of the design in Washington, D.C. It is a hot, humid landscape, and the ground that was provided to build much of the nation's capital was a little bit swampy. And so it was not always a nice place, particularly in the summertime, to be a legislator. So the engineering and statistics people in Washington, D.C. made sure people knew where the trees were and what kinds of trees they were. And they used these kinds of maps to show not only what trees were in the city, but also this was used to ping the conscience of those people who were serving in our government as they had discussions about the need to build something which eventually became the U.S. Forest Service. So getting back towards New Jersey, let's finish up the ramp up into what became the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation. By the 1870s, we had a forestry agent within the Department of Agriculture. By the 1880s, Dr. Bernard Furneaux was appointed as the secretary to the American Forestry Congress. By 1885, New York State, importantly, establishes a first public forest administration and establishes the Adirondack Forest Reserve. So when we think about our sponsors and our friends at New Jersey DEP, Department of Forestry, this is an antecedent to what New Jersey put on the table as a comparable parallel response. In 1890s, Gifford Pinchot goes to Biltmore Estate, quickly realizes that he's a policy guy. He's not an action guy. So Carl Schenck hits Biltmore, and he eventually starts the Biltmore School of Practical Forestry. Pinchot eventually starts Yale up as a policy forward type of a system, whereas Bernard Furneaux was more of a silviculturalist, and he started the program up at Cornell. All three of these people that are the foundations of forestry in New Jersey were all students of Brandeis. In the end, by 1901, the Division of Forestry becomes the Bureau of Forestry, and we're on our way. 1882, New York City Health Commissioner says that there's a high death rate in the summer months, and they determined that trees as the lungs of the city, remember Lucca, Italy, all the way back, remember Paris and the redesign, it was decided that trees were going to be part of that solution. Notice that by 1893, New Jersey has a tree ordinance law that confers powers to communities to enact tree laws and establish the tree commissions, the shade tree commissions that represent the membership of this great body today. Now, New Jersey's always been in the lead, very close to the first, if not the first, in many of those innovations. The Farm Bill of 1990 really brought, in an institutional way in the government, a mechanism for communities all over the United States to kind of catch up to where New Jersey has been operating for a very long time. Well, East Orange in 1904 became a tree commit, organized a tree commission, and it was the third such tree commission in the state of New Jersey. By the time Solotaroff writes his book Shade Trees in Towns and Cities, that's 1911, we went from three tree commissions to 31 tree commissions around the state, and people, particularly in the Northeast, but nationally, were taking notice. And so this textbook, which is probably one of our first urban forestry textbooks in the North American continent, in 1911 is published. This is the community forest management plan for the oranges for East Orange, New Jersey. And it was published this way to meet a demand because people wanted to know how cities like Newark and Orange were doing so well with this urban forestry stuff that everybody else wanted to get a piece of. And indeed, in the book, they had special pages to show that the first thing you need to do is you need to know what you have before you try to manage it or how you try to direct its development. And so they even had this very specially ruled paper at the time to show how you could write an inventory by walking down the street. And for just a small fee, you could buy this very special paper from Orange, New Jersey. So there was a entrepreneurial aspect to this whole thing, which I found kind of fun. Also, this is some work that was done in 1905. White maples on their list are now silver maples in common conversation. And white elm is also known as American elm for some of you who might see the notations and wonder, well, what trees were those? But they had their walking list. They drew a nice map of their street. In this case, it is a street called Shepherd Street between Beach Street and Lenox Avenue. Put it in the book, and then after they show the raw notes, they show what an engineering department can do, putting the tree inventory onto the engineering grids as part of the infrastructure layers, which is something that's why we hope that DPWs work with shade tree commissions, because if we get it in as part of nested infrastructure, things typically go better. And so this was an early example. Again, this is 1905, showing a tree planting and how we go from the inventory into the city documentation as a chapter within this textbook. The one problem is that street never existed. This was a very large, complicated typo. There never was a street segment that drawing represented. It was a whole bunch of people's backyards and it went through several buildings. So, got through the editorial phase. But that particular example, while it's a great example academically, those trees never existed because that street never existed in that particular site. However, we do have plenty of places where we have images, and these are presumed to be accurate. Here we have a bunch of Norway maples that were planted in year 2 of the East Orange Shade Tree Commission. 4 years after planting, here's what this street looked like, 18th Street in East Orange. And isn't it nice? We were planting Norway maples even back then. Here is what they planted in the first year. This is a line of pin oaks. They completely enveloped the street in standing soldier lines of pin oaks in East Orange on Eppert Street. And so this is a nice picture about trees 5 years after planting. And if you go on Google Earth today, you can find Eppert Street. And if you go up close to the large tree in right center, that is a pin oak. We still probably have some of the trees from one of those first Shade Tree Commission activities known in New Jersey. Here we have an even more striking picture. I love this one. This is a street of sugar maples in East Orange. These trees were planted in 1875. So these were a direct response to what was happening in Paris, France, as far as the tree-lined boulevard. And here you've got some very large trees on both sides of the road. And as noted in the caption, the trees were pruned to a uniform height to build a very specific look to the street. Because again, everybody thought this was what they wanted back in the day. Very fashionable. And the citizens of New Jersey were no different. It's just here they had people willing to organize and work in their communities for their communities in service of these communities to ensure a better looking home for everybody involved. Now, outside of New Jersey in 1924, a year before the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation came into existence, a small thing called the National Tree Conference, Shade Tree Conference, was put together. And this was hosted by Bartlett in Connecticut back in the day, about 33 people in a room. That is what became the International Society of Arboriculture, ISA. This is the first antecedent that was organized. Uh, Earlier than that, however, back in the 1890s, Massachusetts had a general law requiring tree wardens to take care of trees in communities over certain critical population sizes. And by 1913, it was a forum for both the foresters in the state and the tree wardens. Tree wardens had quite a bit of power and needed to be licensed for pesticide usage, but they also had to be proficient in tree care in developed landscapes. And so this is the only group that really predates anything that looks like the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation. We're the second oldest. But by 1925, we got ourselves organized, and so we begin. We have our first meeting in 1925, and this is the piece of paper from the New Jersey Department of Conservation and Development, and hand typed by Nelson Gosler as the secretary. And this is our founding document as the New Jersey Shade Tree Federation. They had 2 meetings per year. You paid $1 per year to be a member, and you had one business meeting to talk about the mechanics of the situation, and you had one field session, usually dedicated to a very specific topic. The discussions were probably all over the place, and probably they were done after hours as networking, just like they are today. But by 1928, now we're 3 years into the Federation, they decided that in the 1928, 1927 meeting, our third annual meeting, that there needed to be a way to increase the number of towns that wanted to become shade tree commissions. They needed to up their membership. So they started this bulletin that became a newsletter, which is now the Shade Tree. So this is the first one, number one of volume one, and it was about systematic planting of shade trees under the New Jersey Shade Tree Statute. So this was about how to get actions taken by organizing people as commissions. Um, Very interesting document, and I'm just going to say, as editors go, I'm surprised that Rich Wolowitz wasn't mentioned in this first iteration. Let's think about where we are now. We're 3 years into the Federation, 1928. There were now 135 tree boards. So within 25 years, we've gone from a handful to over 135 Shade Tree Commission type organizations. By 1924, just a few years prior, they allowed counties to do county-wide or county level commissions. And most notably, where Newark and East Orange, where a lot of this stuff started. Newark started in 1904 with their commission. They had planted over 32,000 trees over the 24 years of their existence by that point. That's over 1,300 trees a year by concerned citizens working with their communities, their DPWs, and working with the people to improve the habitats where people were living in close proximity to each other. The shade tree at this point, they usually had at this first year, they had 8 different issues in a 12-month year. Each issue had a single topic. The first one was about planting shade trees. It went to fertilization. It went to insect control. It went to pruning. It went to the problems with bad practice in pruning. It went into the competition between taking care of the lawns and the landscapes and the trees as a public good. They talked about plant selection so that trees would live where we put them next to streets. All of these things we've been talking about ever since, and all of them had their place in this year's the 100th anniversary. The topics are largely the same. The nuance, the technologies have changed, but the imperatives and the challenges have remained ever constant. Pruning was a little bit different back then, though. Here we have, again, that first book from East Orange, and here are the pictures to show how to properly shape and prune a tree, in this case, the oriental plane. Oriental plane, for those of you that don't know it, it's a close relative to the sycamore. If an oriental plane and an American sycamore love each other very much and breed, they become London plane trees or Platanus x hispanica. And so here's a pruning situation where they have a tree where they figure there's too much canopy up at the top, so they skeletonize it, let the regrowth grow. And this is what they were recommending for pruning back in the early 1900s. As a matter of fact, it was so important to get this right and to get that iconic shape and to get your boulevards looking just so with well manicured, well behaved trees that they had special tools chipped into wood that they called dendroscopes that you simply had to hold to your eye to make sure that your shape was in conformance and you could guide your pruning crews in order to get the shape just the way you want. We don't do it this way anymore, folks. Again, the topic is the same, but our technologies have changed. But because trees last a long time, you can see the vestiges of those old practices in older communities throughout the northeastern United States. Here we have a sweet gum that was shaped like a bullet, and then we have the regrowth coming out of it. Here we have somebody who, instead of shaping the trees in an ordinary way, they just top them. This was considered bad practice of topping. And here we have some trees that were topped multiple times, but notice that the shapedness isn't there. So the good versus bad was really about shapedness, even though some of the pruning cuts were just as damaging one way or the other. In New Jersey, we've always had leaders, and here are some of the early ones that we're going to cover. This is Charles Lathrop Pack, who also headed up the Civilians Conservation Corps as reforesting much of the United States during the 1930s. He came up through the lumber industry and resettled into New Jersey in his later years, but he was a huge advocate for mobilizing people to do public goods. He's the one who's credited by and large with the Victory Gardens back in World War II. He was also the one who tried to get forestry established, the American Forestry Association, at the level of Washington, D.C., back in the Roosevelt years to make sure forestry was part of the solutions when they were rebuilding after the Great Depression. Also, notice this is 1934. This is 4 years before the Great Storm of 1938, which totally decimated forests in Northeast US and just restarted the entire lumber industry on the East Coast of the United States. Here's Ephron Felt. Now, Ephron was an interesting person. Um, he was a Bartlett employee back in the day. He would be, for some of you who have been with the Federation a while, this is the Tom Smiley or the Bruce Friedrich or even the Beth Brantley or the Neil Hendrickson, our current president. Um, he was that kind of person, and that was the role he filled. But back then there were fewer people around, and so his voice carried a great weight. And he put this statement out in one of the several books he wrote called Our Shade Trees back in the early 1940s. And I think it's a really good argument that was taken very seriously, and New Jersey Shade Tree Federation and all of the communities that had shade tree commissions, they hung on every word coming out of Dr. Felt. He was a good plant pathologist, and in this case, this is in the shade tree in 1936, where he detailed, and this is one of the first writings we have of how to put a dollar value on a shade tree. And this was taken from some established criteria, some established formula. But here's when we started sharing it with people so that it wasn't just the province of a few experts. It was something that everybody could use to show that there was value in the trees that they were trying to conserve or trying to plant. This is as far back as you can go. This is like what iTree is to us today, being able to put dollars and cents on the value proposition of what we do for the good of our communities. So important, they did it again in 1948 with slightly improved um, equations for how we come up with that tree appraisal value. The reports, like I said, were on single topics, and in top number 7 in the first year of the shade tree, we have street and roadside shade tree planting. This is the precursor to what we have now as trees for New Jersey streets. And when you look at this was what Dyer came up with. It is kind of interesting. You can go on to the second paragraph on page 3. Sugar maple can do well, but it doesn't do well when the soil's compacted. It's basically what it's telling us. It's telling us that Ailanthus could be a really good street tree, and that there's another tree called yellowwood that we're not using enough, but should be considering. And it goes through, and most of the trees that are mentioned here, and most of the arguments on how to select right tree, right place, we've been having the same conversation with many of the same characters. But we always have new volunteers coming on. We have new people who are enabled to advocate for trees. And so this process is that continual cycle of education, empowerment, and action. In this case, uh, the the document that was the shade tree was reflecting some of the other things going on around the country. The U.S. Department of Agriculture was promulgating their farmer bulletin on trees for roadside plantings. And then we have again Massachusetts. They had their park association looking at these trees and trying to come up with recommended trees for urban sites. Both of these, very importantly, advocate for Ailanthus, the tree of heaven, because they noticed that tree of heaven was the only tree that would survive downwind of industrial stacks that were emitting sulfur chemicals, sulfur dioxide, in the process of burning coal or burning other materials. So with New Jersey streets, we went from having it as an occasional topic in the shade tree to its own standalone publication. And we started that in 1961. And you can see we've been revising it and updating it ever since. But this began those documents. We now have laws in New Jersey. We have an ordinance well, the laws and ordinance documents together. We've had that trifold on volcano mulching. we have quite a few different documents that New Jersey has been providing as a service to all the shade tree commissions for now over 50 years, 60 years even. But it's been about that information training, it's sharing, it's been about strategic alliances, building our communities up, serving those communities once they're organized, and building these networks, the vibrant network of all of you listening to me prattle on. This is the 1962 version of League of Municipalities, where the Federation was loud and proud, showing how to properly select, how to properly prune, and how to properly plant trees in New Jersey landscapes. It's volunteers of it's networks of volunteers, excuse me, with a common purpose. It's about that information sharing. We have our documents that we put out. We have the shade tree, which is always giving us updates, formal and informal updates on changes in our industry and notice on the new things that are attacking our trees or posing threats for trees. It's always a place for us to have a point to break bread together and talk about our challenges in our communities and learn how others are solving similar problems. But we also, before we had continuing education units, before we had all of our credentials, we could have it a little bit broader where we would bring in the occasional poet, bring in people from allied industries, and really spread the aperture on what it was to be in a wonderland of trees, not just managing the trees within the urban confines. Over the years, the 1940s were really about developing the certified tree expert law discussions. uh, P.P. Perrone and Edgar Rex were commonly in those meetings, anchoring our speakers back in the 1940s, joined by L.C. Chadwick, the L.C. Chadwick Research Award by the International Society of Arboriculture. L.C. was here in the early 1940s, talking to experts and volunteers alike in the state of New Jersey. 1949 was a big year. We almost doubled the size of the conference as far as the educational sessions. As far back as 1996, Alex Shigo came into town talking about Code It, no doubt. That's compartmentalization of decay in trees. Um, Newark used to hold this conference in the 1940s, but since 1952, if it hasn't been Cherry Hill, it's probably been Atlantic City or Cape May. And again, why are we where we're at? It's the size of this community now, and it's about our ability to do the best with what we have as a community where we can all fit in one spot and break bread together. P.P. Perrone used to be faculty at Cornell, which we'll forgive him for. He also was faculty at Rutgers University. And as a pathologist, he wrote a very foundational arboriculture textbook called Tree Maintenance. He also expanded into urban and community forestry with a commission for the state of Ohio called Open Space in Urban Design, trying to guide tree literate design so we can have tree hospitable management. And that's it. Communities inherit the trees that are in the designs. And so getting the federation involved with the engineering departments, with the design and planning people is that secret sauce. So we inherit tree viable landscapes from which to manage as a volunteer base. Another person who figured it out early, this is Dr. John Kuzer. Many of you remember John. Um, he wrote this foundational book, a handbook for urban community forestry in the Northeast. It was a great seller in Europe. It was very popular in the Northeast. And he wrote this back in the day, we're talking in the 90s. as a response to the Society of American Foresters saying there wasn't enough information to help people manage trees in an urban context. So John took that, ran with it, and came out with this book, which really transformed how a lot of people do their process in urban forestry. The ripples from his footprints are still felt in almost every major city and by anybody in practice, whether they recognize that or not. He also was very good with deciduous evergreens. The deciduous conifers was his passion, a passion that ran so deep. Many of us know of Dawn Redwood with John Kuzer, but he also worked with larch. He also worked with bald cypress. He also worked with sequoia, and he also worked uh, with a couple of other species. But his work was so foundational in the United States that he has his own peer-reviewed research document as an obituary, just so people could keep up with the vision that this man had. And it's always been about people like that, whether it was Lathrop Peck, whether it was the first people in Orange and in Newark, or all of the people that you see on this slide, all of these people that gave of their time to make sure that this conference, this 100th anniversary conference, was a success. And we owe them all a great deal of thanks, as well as the people that have served. You see the list of past presidents. Realize for each name on that white sheet of paper, there is that huge cast of people supporting that president, which you see in the green on the left-hand side. For the hundreds upon hundreds of people who made a difference, who stood up and said they care about trees in their community and made that difference, we owe them all a, a debt of gratitude. So we inherited something that was worth protecting. And I want to thank everybody in the Federation currently because you are the hope for our grandchildren right now. And as it was said on the first day, on the first document from the then brand new New Jersey Shade Tree Federation, the Federation of Shade Tree Commissions will be what we make of it. It can be a real help to each community and to New Jersey as a whole. So let's get back of it and push. And with that, I thank you for your time.